The first-class cabin was quiet in the way money demands silence. Soft lighting, polished wood, leather seats that remembered your shape better than people ever would. The kind of place where voices stayed low, laughter stayed controlled, and eye contact was brief because no one here needed approval. Seat 2A was already occupied by a woman who looked like she belonged there. Margaret Whitmore. She wore beige like it was a uniform of authority. Perfectly pressed coat. Hair styled with intention, not effort. A diamond bracelet rested casually on her wrist, expensive enough to be noticed, but not flashy enough to be questioned. She had boarded early. Of course she had. By the time the man took seat 2B, Margaret had already decided she didn't like him. He didn't look lost. He didn't look nervous. That, somehow, bothered her more. He was quiet. Too quiet. Mid-30s, maybe. Dark skin. Simple gray sweater. No visible luxury watch. No designer bag. Just a small backpack, placed neatly under the seat. Margaret glanced once. Then twice. First class? She thought. Him? She said nothing at first. But silence, when fed by entitlement, never lasts. The flight attendant came by with champagne. "Would you like a drink, sir?" she asked the man. He nodded politely. "Just water, please." Margaret smirked. Water. She waited until the attendant left. "You know," she said, loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear, "first class is usually for people who appreciate the experience." The man turned slightly. Calm eyes. No irritation. "I appreciate quiet," he replied. That should have ended it. But Margaret leaned back, crossing her legs. "Well, some people are just happy to sit wherever they're placed." A couple behind them exchanged looks. The man said nothing this time, and that silence felt like an insult to her. She tried again. "Is this your first time flying first class?" Still calm. Still polite. "No," he said. She laughed softly. "Could have fooled me." Across the aisle, a younger woman frowned. A businessman adjusted his glasses uncomfortably. No one spoke. Margaret felt powerful. People like her always did when no one stopped them. As the plane began taxiing, she leaned closer. "I just hope you understand," she said, lowering her voice but not the venom. "This section has standards." That was when the man finally turned fully toward her. Not angry. Not defensive. Just curious. "What standard would that be?" he asked. Margaret opened her mouth. Then stopped. Because something in his eyes told her. She was stepping into a story she did not control. And she had no idea how expensive that mistake would become. The seatbelt sign was still on when Margaret decided silence wasn't enough. The plane rolled slowly toward the runway, a smooth mechanical hum vibrating through the cabin. The kind of moment where people settled in, checked phones, adjusted blankets, and prepared to disappear into themselves. But Margaret Whitmore was not interested in disappearing. She was interested in being seen. She pressed the call button. The soft ding echoed louder than it should have in first class. A flight attendant appeared almost instantly. Young. Professional. Her smile was trained, her posture perfect. "Yes, ma'am?" Margaret tilted her head slightly, gesturing, subtly, but deliberately, toward the man in seat 2B. "I'm feeling uncomfortable." The word landed carefully. Strategically. The attendant's eyes flicked toward him for half a second. Just long enough. "I see," she said cautiously. "May I ask why?" Margaret sighed, like she hated having to explain something obvious. "He's making me uneasy," she said. "He hasn't done anything specific, but, you know." No one knew. Everyone pretended they did. The man in 2B looked up slowly. "Is there a problem?" he asked calmly. Margaret didn't look at him. She looked at the attendant. "I just think maybe he's in the wrong section." There it was. The accusation without evidence. The judgment without proof. The attendant hesitated. "Sir," she said, turning to him, "may I see your boarding pass?" He reached into his pocket without protest, handing it over. "First class. Seat 2B. Paid in full." The attendant's posture relaxed immediately. "Everything seems in order," she said politely, handing it back. Margaret's smile tightened. "Well, she said. That's surprising. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. Across the aisle, the young woman who had frowned earlier now watched openly. Her discomfort was visible, but still, she said nothing. The attendant gave a polite nod and moved on. Margaret leaned back, irritated. But irritation for people like her didn't fade. It fermented. Moments later, drinks were served again, this time wine. Margaret took a glass of red, swirling it slowly. She watched the liquid move, dark and elegant. Then she stood up. The plane was still taxiing, but first-class rules were different. She stepped slightly into the aisle, adjusting her coat. "Oh, sorry," she said loudly, turning suddenly towards seat 2B. Her hand tilted. The wine spilled. Not a splash. A pour. Deep red liquid soaked into the man's gray sweater, blooming across his chest like a stain that couldn't be ignored. A sharp gasp rippled through the cabin. "Oh my God," Margaret said, hand flying to her mouth, but her eyes told a different story. "I'm so clumsy," she added, her voice dripping with fake embarrassment. "I hope that wasn't expensive." The man looked down at his sweater, then back up. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He didn't even stand. "It's fine," he said quietly. That response unsettled her more than anger ever could. A man too rose back, muttered, "Jesus." The young woman across the aisle shook her head in disbelief. Margaret laughed lightly. "Well," she said, "at least it'll give you something to remember this flight by." The flight attendant rushed over. "Sir, are you all right?" He nodded. "Yes." "I'll get napkins," she said quickly. Margaret waved her hand dismissively. "It was an accident," she announced to the cabin. No need to make it dramatic. But drama was already there. Thick. Heavy. Unavoidable. As the attendant dabbed at the sweater, Margaret leaned in close, lowering her voice just enough. "Next time," she whispered, "try economy. People won't notice you as much." The man finally looked directly at her. Not angry. Not hurt. Something else. Measured. "You're very comfortable assuming things," he said. She smiled. Experience. The engines roared louder as the plane picked up speed. And then takeoff. The city dropped away beneath them, light scattering like consequences no one wanted to face yet. The cabin settled into silence again. But it was no longer calm. It was charged. The man closed his eyes briefly, breathing in through his nose, then out. He had learned long ago that reacting gave people like Margaret exactly what they wanted. And he was not here to give her anything. Not yet. What no one in that cabin knew, what Margaret could never imagine, was that this flight wasn't a random inconvenience for him. It was a transition. And she had just crossed paths with a man who had built his entire life mastering one skill. At cruising altitude, first class returned to its ritual of quiet luxury. Seatbelts clicked open. Screens flickered to life. Soft music filled the cabin like an apology no one planned to make. But the tension hadn't gone anywhere. It had only learned how to sit still. Margaret Whitmore reclined her seat, wine refilled, posture relaxed, as if nothing unusual had happened. To her, the incident was already over. A minor inconvenience. A moment she would forget by the time the plane landed. She had no idea the moment had only just begun. 2 rows back, a senior flight attendant leaned toward the younger one who had witnessed the spill. "Write it up," she whispered, "just in case." The younger attendant hesitated. She did it on purpose. "I know," the senior attendant replied quietly, "but write it carefully." Carefully. That word carried weight in places like first class. Margaret noticed the glances now. Not admiration, curiosity. Suspicion. She hated that. She leaned toward the aisle, speaking loudly enough for the cabin to hear. "Honestly," she said, shaking her head, "people are so sensitive these days." No one agreed. No one challenged her. Except one voice. "That wasn't sensitivity," a man across the aisle said calmly. "That was disrespect." Margaret turned, eyes sharp. "Excuse me?" The man was mid-40s, well-dressed, understated wealth. The kind of person who never raised his voice because he'd never needed to. You spilled wine on someone, he said. Intentionally. She laughed. Are you accusing me of something? I'm stating what I saw. The cabin went silent. Margaret's smile froze. Well, she said coolly, maybe you should mind your own business. The man didn't respond. He didn't need to, because others were watching now. The young woman from earlier leaned forward slightly. She's right, she said softly. You were out of line. Margaret stared at her. You don't know what you're talking about. The man in seat 2B, the quiet one, finally spoke again. Please, he said, voice even. There's no need to argue. That sentence changed everything. Because it wasn't weakness. It was control. Margaret scoffed. How noble. She turned away, satisfied. Or so she thought. Minutes later, the cabin door to the cockpit opened briefly. A pilot stepped out, speaking quietly with the senior flight attendant. Papers were exchanged. Margaret didn't notice. But the man in 2B did. He always noticed. The pilot glanced toward first class just once. And stopped. His eyes narrowed slightly. Then widened. Not with fear. With recognition. He leaned closer to the attendant. Seat 2B, he asked under his breath. The attendant nodded. The pilot exhaled slowly. Understood. Margaret laughed at something on her phone, oblivious. The man in 2B closed his laptop, folding his hands neatly in his lap. The captain didn't approach him. He didn't need to. Because respect didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply adjusted course. An hour later, meals were served. Margaret barely touched hers. She was too busy feeling watched. The looks hadn't stopped. They had shifted. From curiosity to calculation. Finally, she leaned toward the aisle again. I want to file a complaint, she announced. The senior flight attendant nodded. Of course, ma'am. Margaret pointed, openly this time, at seat 2B. He's been intimidating me all flight. The word hung in the air like smoke. The attendant looked at the man. Sir? He met her eyes calmly. I haven't spoken to her unless spoken to, he said. That's not the point, Margaret snapped. His presence. Ma'am. The attendant interrupted gently but firmly. We're handling this. Margaret leaned back, annoyed. She had expected compliance, not balance. What she didn't know, what she couldn't see, was the note already logged in the system. Passenger behavior. Instigator. Crew observation. Deliberate provocation. Margaret had lost control of the narrative. And she didn't even realize it yet. As the cabin lights dimmed, the man in seat 2B stared out the window. Clouds drifted past like erased assumptions. A memory surfaced. Years ago. Another room. Another accusation. He had been younger then. Angrier. And it had cost him. He had learned since. Silence wasn't surrender. It was leverage. When the lights brightened again, the senior flight attendant approached him quietly. Sir, she said softly, the captain wanted me to let you know we're aware. He nodded once. Thank you. She hesitated. Would you like to move seats? He shook his head. No. Margaret watched this exchange from the corner of her eye. Something cold settled in her stomach. Because for the first time since boarding, she wasn't sure who was actually in control. The cabin lights dimmed again, softer this time. Not for comfort, for control. Margaret Whitmore noticed it immediately. She had flown enough to know the rhythm of long-haul flights. This wasn't normal. Something had shifted. The air felt different, less indulgent, more deliberate. She adjusted in her seat, suddenly aware of how often eyes flicked toward her and then away. Across the aisle, the man she had dismissed as invisible sat perfectly still, unbothered, as if waiting for something inevitable. The senior flight attendant returned, posture straighter now. Professional, but no longer neutral. Ma'am, she said quietly to Margaret, the captain would like a word with you. Margaret blinked. The captain? Yes. Now heads turned openly. First class didn't pretend anymore. Margaret forced a laugh. Is this really necessary? I'm afraid so. Margaret stood, smoothing her coat, chin raised. She glanced once at seat 2B. He didn't look back. That unsettled her more than anything else. She followed the attendant toward the front. Inside the galley, the captain waited. Mid-50s.
Come.
Authority worn lightly, but unmistakably. Ms. Whitmore, he said. Please have a seat. She complied, irritation creeping in. I understand there's been some discomfort during the flight, he continued. Yes, Margaret said quickly. I've felt unsafe. The captain didn't respond immediately. He reviewed a tablet, scrolled,
Paused.
According to crew reports, he said slowly, there was an intentional spill. Margaret scoffed. That's ridiculous. Multiple witnesses say otherwise. She crossed her arms. So now I'm on trial? No, the captain replied evenly. But behavior matters up here. Margaret leaned forward. That man shouldn't have been seated next to me in the first place. The captain finally looked up. Why? She hesitated, just a fraction too long. He doesn't belong here. The silence that followed was surgical. The captain set the tablet down. Ms. Whitmore, he said, voice calm but edged, do you know who you were seated next to? Her stomach tightened.
No, she said.
Should I? Yes, he replied. You should. He leaned in slightly. That passenger is a federal aviation consultant. He advises on airline security, compliance, and discrimination protocols. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. That's not. He was invited aboard this flight by our parent company, the captain continued, discreetly, for observation. Margaret's mouth opened.
Closed.
He's flown over 2 million miles, the captain added. And he's filed exactly 0 complaints in his career. Margaret swallowed. And tonight, the captain said, you gave him reason to. The weight of it crushed her breath. You see, he continued, he's not required to identify himself. But when I glanced at the manifest earlier, I recognized the name. Margaret's voice came out thin. What name? The captain stood. Mr. Daniel Cross. The name rippled through the cockpit doorway. Outside, in first class, the man in seat 2B felt the shift before he saw it. The captain emerged. He walked straight to him. Passengers froze. Margaret watched from the galley, heart hammering. Mr. Cross, the captain said respectfully, thank you for your patience. Daniel looked up. Of course. If there's anything you need, the captain added, please let us know. Daniel nodded. There is. Every ear leaned in. I'd like to finish the flight in peace, he said calmly. For everyone. The captain inclined his head. Understood. Then he turned. Ms. Whitmore, he said firmly, you'll be moving seats.
What? She snapped.
I paid for first class. And you're still in it, he replied. Just not here. She was escorted, politely, publicly, 3 rows back. The whispers started immediately. Did you see that? Who is he? She messed up. Margaret sat stiffly, humiliation burning hotter than anger ever had. Daniel returned his gaze to the window. The clouds below looked peaceful. He knew better. Because consequences never rushed. They waited. The plane descended quietly. No turbulence. No announcements beyond the standard calm voice from the cockpit. But first class was anything but calm. Margaret Whitmore sat 3 rows back now, still in first class, but stripped of status. Her seat felt smaller. The air felt heavier. Every movement around her felt like judgment. No one spoke to her. No one looked away either. She kept replaying the captain's words. Federal Aviation Consultant. Observation. The name. Daniel Cross. She had Googled it in her head 100 times already. The realization burned. Across the cabin, Daniel remained exactly as he had been all flight. Quiet.
Composed.
Uninterested in her discomfort. That was the cruelest part. He wasn't enjoying this. Which meant this wasn't about revenge. It was about consequence. When the wheels finally touched down, applause broke out in economy. In first class, no one clapped. Seatbelts clicked on. Bags were pulled down. Reality settled in. The senior flight attendant approached Daniel once more. Sir, she said softly, there will be a brief follow-up after landing. He nodded. I understand. Margaret watched this exchange with dread tightening her chest. She stood as soon as the seatbelt sign turned off, ready to leave, escape, vanish. But 2 uniformed airline security officers were already at the front. "Ms. Whitmore," one of them said politely, "we'll need a moment of your time." Her face flushed. "Is this really necessary?" "Yes, ma'am." The cabin went still. Phones stayed in pockets, but memories didn't. She was escorted aside. Not handcuffed. Not shouted at. Worse. Handled professionally. Daniel waited until nearly everyone had deplaned. Then he stood. The young woman who had defended him earlier met his eyes. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I should have spoken sooner." He smiled gently. "You did when it mattered." In the jet bridge, the captain shook his hand. "Thank you," he said. Not everyone would have handled that with such restraint. Daniel shrugged lightly. "I learned the hard way." In a quiet conference room near the gate, paperwork was finalized. Witness statements, crew reports, security logs. Margaret sat across the table, hands clenched. She finally looked at Daniel directly. "You could ruin me," she said bitterly. Daniel met her gaze. "I could," he said, "but that's not why I'm here." She laughed sharply. "Then why?" He paused. "Because people like you rely on silence," he said calmly. "But you mistake silence for permission." She looked away. "I won't file a personal lawsuit," he continued. "But the report stands. Your behavior will be reviewed." Her voice cracked. "You don't know what this will cost me." He nodded. "I do." That was the truth. Because years ago it had cost him everything. Daniel stood to leave. At the door, he stopped. "One more thing," he said. She looked up. "You assumed I didn't belong," he said evenly. "And you were right." Her eyes widened. "I belong wherever respect exists," he finished. "And today you didn't." He left the room. Weeks later, Margaret's name would quietly disappear from her company's leadership page. No headlines. No scandal. Just absence. Daniel returned to his work. Different flights. Different cabins. Same silence. But now, that silence carried weight.